I want to begin with two photos. This is Bice in 1908, so she's 20 or 21. The quality, unfortunately, is not very good, but we see a very striking young woman, very elegant, a bit theatrical in her pose, a bit daring with bare shoulders and a lacework dress or blouse. She has the large dark eyes and the long eyelids that Giacomo remarks. Her hair is long but plaited and worn atop her head, which was typical of the period. Here instead is Bice in 1911, which is probably the year she started taking lessons with Joyce. Only 3 years have elapsed, but her appearance is quite different. There are elements of Succession or the Munich school. In fact, this may be a photo for a portrait by one of the local painters. The antelope eyes are very dark and lustrous, and she wears a fillet in her hair, as we find in the Logione passage. If we compare the two photos, I think it gives some idea of the very rapid acceleration taking place at this time, especially in the visual arts, but also in how Bice presents herself in her personalization. Almost every photo seems to show a different person, and this may have influenced the text, which, as Adeline Glasheen noted many years ago, is essentially a series of discrete sketches. So, who was Bice Ricchetti Randegger? Bice was born in Trieste on the 25th of October, 1887. Her father, Ettore Ricchetti, was a lawyer and one of the leaders of the local Jewish community, and her mother, Clotilde, was a descendant of one of the oldest and most prominent Triestine Jewish families, the Morpurgos. Bice lived until the age of 13 in a house next to the Church of St. Anthony the Miracle Worker at the head of the canal, in a building which is no longer extant. So she was raised at the very heart of Trieste, right along the canal, in what was one of the most characteristic and dynamic parts of the city. Bice was the third of 5 children, but the first child, Bianca, died at age 7 shortly after Bice's birth. Here's a group photo of the family from 1903 or 1904. It's an informal souvenir photo from Berchtesgaden in Bavaria, but it seems to be the only family photo that has survived. We see the father, Ettore Ricchetti, looking very much like the Grand Turk with his harem. Clotilde, the mother, who James Joyce describes as a portly hen 10 years later, and in fact is a better match than Amalia Popper's mother, who was quite thin. Then the children, Clelia or Lily, born in 1885, who married a Jewish industrialist at age 20 and moved to Milan. Then there's Bice, who's 15 or 16 here, once again very striking, very pretty, knows exactly where the camera is. Then there's the only male child at the rear, Emilio, born in 1890, and finally Eleonora, or Nora, born in 1892, and who may have taken lessons with Bice and be the classmate that Joyce mentions early in the text. Nora never married and lived with various family members for most of her life. In the 1930s, she went to live in Cortina, in the mountains. In January 1944, during the Nazi occupation, she was arrested as a Jew and deported to Auschwitz, where she was killed shortly after her arrival. In 1901, the family moved to a villa in Scorcola, which is a very steep upland just outside of the center of Trieste. And this is where the lessons and other events described in Giacomo Joyce took place. The villa was just uphill from the Rali Villa, which is in Piazza Scorcola at the base of the hill. Joyce would come here to teach Ambrogio Rali, one of the richest men in Trieste, and then all he had to do was turn the corner and walk up this very steep street to the Ricchetti Villa, which was about 150 yards uphill. Today, the villa is a Catholic elementary school, but the original building has been preserved, and as we can see, it's a very handsome, imposing residence. Here we have some historical photos of the rear of the villa, and we see something interesting, which is the external staircase. In the passage where Giacomo hears the heels clacking on the stone stairs, most people have assumed that this was an internal staircase, but Joyce refers to a turret, which of course is an external architectural feature. Here instead is the internal staircase, which is quite narrow, and in fact the villa is only about 15 meters wide, and so the rooms are relatively small and more intimate and self-contained. Now let's take a closer look at Bici's father, Ettore Ricchetti. This photo dates from late 1914, and we can see that he matches the description given by Joyce. He has the very long white whiskers and the strongly Jewish features. He's also the right age, 63, and despite his very imposing appearance, is probably a bit frail, in ill health. In fact, Ettore only has a few years left to live and would die in August 1917. In 1914, Ettore Ricchetti was one of the most prominent and powerful men in Trieste. He was president of Generali Insurance, president of the Jewish community, deputy mayor of Trieste for the Liberal National or Irredentist Party, and had been president of the Triestine Bar Association since 1900, which was a very influential position. He was also on the board of directors of various companies and was even president of the board of curators of the Revoltella Business School, where Joyce began teaching in 1913. However, in terms of the text, his most significant position was that of a director of the Stabilimento Tecnico Triestino, which was the largest shipyard in Trieste and thus in the empire. Between 1910 and 1914, the Stabilimento built 3 Tegethoff-class battleships for the Austrian Navy. These were the equivalent of dreadnoughts, so very powerful, top-of-the-line capital ships that the Austrians built in order to counter the Italian naval supremacy in the Adriatic. These ships were also enormously expensive and thus brought huge profits to the Stabilimento and to its shareholders, of which Ettore was definitely one. We thus have this very typical Triestine situation of a fire-breathing, anti-Austrian irredentist like Ettore, who was building warships for the Austrians and getting quite rich doing it, and then railing about people who didn't stand for the Italian national anthem over dinner. So when Joyce remarks in Giacomo that they love their country when they know which country it is, he could certainly be referring to someone like Ettore. The most important element for identifying the young woman in Giacomo has always been the operation, which is described in a very intense sequence in the text. Every candidate seems to miraculously develop appendicitis and then is just as miraculously cured by an operation, but without any proof or documentation. Instead, with Bice, we have proof. On the 28th of December 1912, Bice was taken to the Sanatorio Triestino, which was a private clinic for the Triestine upper classes in Via Rossetti. This is the register for 1912, and we can see that she entered the sanatorio on the evening of the 28th with a diagnosis of appendicitis. And here we see that an appendectomy was performed the same evening, so an emergency operation, with zaffamento, which means packing the wound with gauze and disinfectant to prevent infection. The surgeon was Dr. d'Este, and the assistants were also physicians, Gal and Gandusio, so she received very good care. She remained at the sanatorio until the 11th of January 1913, and then went home to convalesce. Given that the Hamlet lectures had begun in mid-November, Bice would have been able to attend one or more of the lectures before falling ill, and Beatrice in Exiles also refers to a near-fatal illness. So this is a very decisive piece of evidence in favor of Bice, who is the only candidate for whom there is documented proof of an operation. Now we come to another key episode, which is the marriage. On the 30th of January 1914, Bice formally announced her intention to marry this gentleman, Henry Victor Randegger, in a civil ceremony in Trieste. Randegger, born in 1885, was English by nationality, but born and raised in Trieste, together with his 3 brothers, by their widowed mother, Victoria. Henry Victor was related to Albert Randegger, a well-known musician in London, and he was the cousin of Eugenio Randegger, also a very noted local musician and composer whom Joyce in fact mentions in a letter in 1905. In Austria at that time, so-called mixed marriages were required to go through a rather complicated bureaucratic procedure. Here we see Bice's signature on the marriage application, which shows an extremely fine calligraphy as described in the text. Bice and Henry Victor were married at the Trieste City Hall on the 19th of February, and after what was probably a long honeymoon, they moved into a flat in Piazza Scorcola, just downhill from the Ricchetti villa. On the 19th of June 1914, Joyce presented Bice with a copy of Dubliners, which was thus probably a belated wedding gift, and is in fact inscribed to Beatrice Randegger. Shortly after, on the 1st of July 1914, Bice formally renounced her Jewish faith, and she and Henry Victor were probably remarried in a Protestant religious ceremony, either in Trieste or in Vienna in 1916. Now we're in the period of World War I, where things get a bit complicated. War breaks out in August 1914, though Italy did not enter the war until late May 1915. During this period, both Joyce and the Randeggers remained in Trieste, even though, as British subjects, they were considered enemy nationals and were required to observe a series of restrictions. In January 1915, Stanislaus was arrested and interned near Rabs in northern Austria, and he would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner. In April or early May, Ettore and the rest of his family left Trieste for Milan. Emilio, the brother, had also left for Italy and had enlisted as a volunteer in the Italian military. He was assigned to a cavalry unit, the Vercelli Lancers, who were stationed in Vercelli in Piemonte. Here he is during his military service, probably in Vercelli. In 1916, Ettore and his family moved to Vercelli in order to be near Emilio. Ricchetti, of course, is mentioned in what is one of the more obscure passages in Giacomo Joyce. Now, I think this is just a coincidence, but it's possible that the Ricchetti family had some connection with Vercelli before the war, which would raise some interesting questions. The Joyces finally left Trieste on the 21st of July 1915 and arrived in Zurich 8 or 9 days later. In August, Bice and the Randegger family also left Trieste for Switzerland, but were blocked at Feldkirch on the Swiss border, and the Randegger brothers were arrested and interned at Rabs. This is a photo of the Randegger brothers, Henry Victor in the back, Charles and William, with some other prisoners taken at Kirchberg, the castle near Rabs, where Stanislaus was also interned. Bice and Victoria were free to go, but apparently petitioned the Austrians to be able to stay with the brothers and rejoined them a few weeks later. So this is a photo of the Randegger family reunited, though it's not clear exactly where or when it was taken. But two of the suitcases on the left have stickers on them, which read Weidhofen an der Thaya, which was the nearest train station to Rabs, so this must be after their arrest at Feldkirch. The caption reads in Triestine dialect, 3 carriages, 16 suitcases, 5 people, including the writer, 2 hats and 3 berets, and everyone with their head held high and smiling. Here's a group photo of mostly English prisoners with a Christmas greeting to be sent to the families. Victoria is seated front row center, Bice is seated to the right, and the Randegger brothers are standing separately behind them. If we look at a detail of this photo, we see that Bice is wearing a very opulent fur and a hat with some sort of ornament, possibly a flower. And at her right hip there's the outline of something which might be a case for glasses. Bice wore very thick glasses later in life, but there are no photos of her with glasses as a young person. However, Joyce describes a student as needing glasses to read, both the quizzing glasses and in exiles, so she may have been far-sighted. In any case, we have the heavy furs described in the very first passage of Giacomo Joyce. Now, the English being English, even when they're POWs, they decide to hold a Christmas dinner concert. The program for this concert has survived, and we can see that there was a play and then a concert with various people singing and performing. Bice sang 3 songs, including Vici d'amore from Tosca, and this reinforces the idea that she and Joyce may have sung together or participated in musical evenings in Trieste. In 1916, Bice and Henry Victor were given permission to move to Vienna and live in a private flat. In November of that year, she gave birth to her first child, a son, Vivian. This is a picture postcard from late 1917 with Bice, Henry Victor, and Vivian. On the back are the wartime censorship stamps, and here we see a detail of Bice's handwriting, which again is quite elegant. Immediately after the armistice in early November 1918, Bice returned to Trieste, which was now occupied by Italy. Both of her parents were deceased, Ettore in 1917, Clotilde a year later, so Bice was now a very wealthy person. Here we see her with her second child, Mildred, who was born in Vienna in September 1918, so this must be right after her return to Trieste, though it could still be Vienna. And then a second photo, a couple of months later, with Bice looking a bit haggard and very Middle European. So this is more or less what Bice looked like when Joyce met her again in November 1919 and presented her with a copy of Portrait. She is now a mature woman, 32 years old, with 2 young children and 4 very difficult years behind her. So a very different person from the pre-war Bice. We do not know the circumstances of this meeting, or if they ever met again or maintained some sort of contact. Personally, I rather doubt it. 2 final photos before we take our leave of Bice. This is the redeemed Trieste of 1923-1924, right after annexation by Italy, when everything seemed hunky-dory, at least for the people who were on the winning side. This is some sort of cross-country equestrian event, on the Carso probably. And this is Bice with her 2 children in 1925 at Montebello, the racetrack in Trieste. This is a rather sad photo actually, because a few months later her daughter Mildred, who looks a bit like Shirley Temple here, would die of acute pneumonia at the age of only 7. So a very tragic event, which was followed 5 years later by the accidental death of Henry Victor in an airplane crash in Zara, Dalmatia. Bice would remarry in 1934 to a retired Italian general by the name of Giuseppe Gigli. We now enter a very dark historical period. We have the race laws in 1938, with both Bice and Vivian considered to be racial Jews, and then the war and the Nazi occupation of Trieste in 1944, which forced Bice into hiding on one of the family properties in Veneto. After the war, she returns to Trieste and for the next 20 years lived a very quiet, retired life with General Gigli. Bice died in 1964 and was buried at the British Cemetery, just a short distance from where Stanislaus Joyce is buried, in the family plot of his wife, Nellie Lichtensteiger. So not in the tomb of her people, as Joyce says in Giacomo Joyce, but in that of her adopted family and religion. A final postscript. As we know, Giacomo Joyce was finally published in 1968 to considerable media fanfare. Sometime after its publication, William Randegger, who had emigrated to America and was living in New York, either sent or presented this copy of the first trade edition to Vivian, Bice's son, who was now living in Milan. The Randeggers were not readers of Joyce, so it's quite likely that William had recognized his sister-in-law Bice in the text, based on what she might have told the Randeggers about her relationship with Joyce many years before. Her side of the story is lost, unfortunately, but at least it has been possible to reconstruct some of her life, especially during the period in which she was privileged to have had James Joyce as her teacher, and perhaps something more, and during which Joyce was also very fortunate to have known someone like Bice and her family. That, at least, is my view.